Wir sind absolut glücklich, dass Carolyn Lukensmeyer hier bei uns sein kann, weil sie, ich will mal so sagen, einen ganz kurzen Ausschnitt ihrer Zeit für uns zur Verfügung stellt, da sie im Moment sehr stark damit beschäftigt ist, eben den Aufbau von New Orleans in dieser Form, die sie uns vorstellen wird, mitzugestalten. Carolyn Lukensmeyer ist, so finden wir, eine der großen Frauen der Organisation oder man kann eben besser sagen Gesellschaftsentwicklung. Sie hat es für sich als Thema übernommen, gesellschaftliche Entwicklung zu gestalten und hier auf Methoden, Möglichkeiten, Strukturen zurückzugreifen, die eben aus der Organisationsentwicklung heraus entstanden sind. Ganz wichtig ist, und das unterscheidet sie in vielen Fällen von anderen Großgruppen, Veranstaltungen, dass es von einem hohen demokratischen Verständnis geprägt ist, was sie tut. Das heißt, sie schafft Strukturen, um eben tiefgreifende demokratische Entscheidungen mit einem hohen politischen Anspruch zu realisieren. Und wir wünschen Ihnen ganz viel Spaß dabei, einen Teil davon erleben zu dürfen und eine Idee davon zu bekommen, was das heißt. Viel Spaß.
You were asking me why the computer does that, and it's a program that is in the computer that has the goal to always remind me of what Fred said, you know. It reminds me to go on vacation from time to time.
Okay. Let me say that having shared the morning with you, a couple of things stand out to me. I've done a tremendous amount of public speaking in my life, and I actually really love to engage through the capacity to speak my truth. But I'd have to acknowledge that as I shared the morning with you, I felt a little bit intimidated, or maybe the word is truly humbled, by what I'm following. And I'm surprised at the depth of my own emotion at the moment, but that's okay. It's just the way it is, and you'll have to be with me. If you think about Fred's time with us this morning, and as I experienced myself, and as I watched all of you experience, Fred's very presence and Fred's very being at this stage in his life is to be the embodiment of a person who has committed to living his life in a way in which he is being as whole a human being as he is capable of being. And when we see someone, when we're in the presence of someone who has lived their life that way and is very open about being that person in the moment, where it takes us is to our hearts. Where it takes us is to what is one of the core gifts of being a human being, the capacity to love completely and deeply. I mean, think yourself about how you responded and where your own energy existed in your own being while listening to Fred. So we've had an extraordinary experience this morning of a quick dip into the essence of one of the most important things about being a human being, the capacity to love. We then were gifted by an extraordinary teacher to take us into the world of music. And what music or any art form does for us as a human being is connects us, hopefully from a space of humility, to all that is universal. And again, I'll just speak about my own body, and I could see it on many of your faces as well. In the moments in which we were really with the music, it actually does transform you to be more fully connected to all of the universal energies. I would guess some of you could really feel in your body more space opening up as you cleared into stillness and were essentially more connected literally to earth energy and more connected to universal energy. A Buddhist or someone else in a deep meditation process would actually be able to describe to you in great detail the movement of the energy along your spinal column as you allowed that music to be more deeply in your being. So this feels a little bit risky. I don't think I've ever done this before. But if I just were to say what I'm following, what I've now been given the gift of holding the stage after deep heart energy and after human beings' ability to connect to the universal through the expression of art, music. If one thing happens for you out of my time on your stage, is I hope that it taps in you what is already in you, as is it in every single human being walking the face of the earth. But it is to feel more deeply connected to your own experience of courage. Because in fact, we are living in a world at a time in which whatever your place may be, whether it is the poorest villager in sub-Saharan Africa, or whether it is holding a CEO job in a corporation, we are facing a world that demands extraordinary structural transformation in an extremely short period of time. And if we're actually going to step up to the challenge that's facing us as the human race, one of the critical elements of doing that will be that every single one of us, in our own place, in our own time, increases the level of courage we bring to speaking the truth of what we experience at that moment in time. And then understanding that the structural change that is required of us can only come about in an equitable and just way if what I really care the most about is not just my truth or the freedom for me to speak my truth, but is the potential of collectively taking responsibility to understand what the collective truth of the human race is today. And potentially for the first time in human history, to actually make those tough decisions about how to allocate resources, those tough decisions about who wins and who loses in what time frame, to make them out of the framework truly of the belief that we are all responsible for the whole, and if all of our voices have a place in determining the future of the whole, there is the possibility of creating a future of which we are still a part and which is more equitable and more just than any previous time in human history. And I guess we definitely should go to the beach. It's your machine. You'll have to punch me back in. while he's doing that, I actually want to take a minute now for you to have a moment of time. In the context of what I just said, of the mantra, we're all responsible for the whole, just drop inside personally for a minute or two and think quickly on 3 levels of system. My community. By my community, I mean the place I live. The place that I'm invested with my family, my house, and many of us live lives that truly do give us a global perspective. But there's still some place I plant my feet. It's where I really want to go to bed at night. So my community. Think momentarily about that. And then the place that you have invested your work. Whatever that, for some of you, it may be a single organization. For others of you, you may be external consultants providing your services to lots of organizations. But essentially, where you're making an impact for work. And the last level is, in fact, something that's real today in a way that it has not been previously, is our responsibility as citizens of the world. So think at the world level. And I want to ask you to just quickly do an inventory. In my community, what are the 2 or 3 issues that most need to be faced and dealt with differently to create a better world? Then think about it in your work setting. What are the 2 or 3 issues that most need to be faced to help that organization take responsibility for the whole? And then last, at the world level, totally your personal perspective, what do you believe are the 2 or 3 issues that we collectively must face in the next 10 years if, in fact, we're going to create the future we'd like to have? So just quickly do that inventory. My community, my work, my world. The 2 or 3 issues that most need to be faced if we're going to create the world we'd like to live in. I may be rushing you, but if you haven't gotten to the 2 or 3 facing the world yet, skip to that at this point. I'd like to ask you now, just at your tables, to quickly just share the 2 or 3 issues that you said at the world level of system. Leave the other data for yourself at this point. And not a lot of time to talk about it. This could be an entire workshop of its own. And if you're at a table by yourself, why don't you join another table, because I think you'll have more fun. So just quickly, and please listen carefully to what everyone else's issues are, because at the end I'm going to ask you, what are the issues that come from your table? So listen to everyone's issues. Just quickly share them. Don't try to solve them. If you could finish up your conversations and someone at the table be ready to say out loud, what are the 2 or 3 issues that emerged from your table? Okay, if I could pull your attention back up here, and if someone would just from each table stand up and say, what are the 2 or 3 issues that our table, the most voices focused on, if that's possible from your table. Can I start over here? Somebody from your table? Just stand up and say, what were the 2 or 3 issues that came up the most times? Yeah? Okay. Okay, so ecology, sustainability were the world issues, and the other 2 were individual in terms of... Yes. Okay, great. Thank you. Another table. Anybody?
Biological
Yeah. Conflicts. Yes. Okay. Can you hear, or do I need to repeat them? Okay, great. Thank you very much. Another table? And it's okay to repeat them. It's just what your table said. How can we actually work together to create a earth that we can live on? Great. Another table. Yes. Okay, thank you. Another table. Yep. Could you hear those? He was a little... Great. Okay, thank you. Some other table. Speed. Mm-hmm. Self-esteem was the last one. Okay, someone else. Yes, please.
We spoke about what does it need to go about all these enormous tasks of the future. It's very easy. It's the same on all levels. Creating contact,
Creating contact.
plus understanding, and the attitude we need. I only know the word in German.
That's
Gelassenheit.
Gelassenheit. Thank you. Okay, a couple more tables. I can see you're not going to make it easy for me to get a comment from all tables, so just take just a couple more, right? Yes. To work on those problems. Yep. On the world level. Okay. Another table? Yeah, please.
Two levels. One was broaden your horizon and tolerance. Was that probably the other one would be we talk about quality, resources, resource allocation, human rights, important political level, but also that unemployment, conflict, migration, diversity, culture.
Thank you. We'll come back to these issues later, and for me they've formed the basis of 2 or 3 assumptions I now treat as reality. So this is truth in lending here in terms of how I'm going to speak to you around some assumptions that I make about what it takes to deal with the kinds of realities that you have all described. One can be captured in the very often used famous quote from Einstein, who says, the problems, the level of thinking that created the problems we're dealing with cannot create the solutions. Sometimes that quote is said as the level of thinking. Sometimes that quote is said the level of consciousness that created these problems cannot solve them. So it is a profound, at some level, acceptance and relaxing in to the reality that if we're really going to solve global hunger, which we clearly have the resources to do. It is not a resource issue. If we're going to clearly make the shift to stop destroying life species on the planet, which we clearly have the resources to do, it's going to take a shift in thinking and a shift in consciousness. The second assumption that I work on every day is that up to this point, and Fred spoke about this morning in knowledge, how we divide knowledge up into little categories, we each become experts in those knowledge, and then the real challenge is to reintegrate it into something whole. We've done exactly the same thing with institutional structures. For centuries, we divided the world for sure in 2, and a little bit more than 2. We had government, whose responsibility it was to care for the common good or the common ground. And we had business, whose responsibility it was to create capital and resources to, in fact, deal with the solutions in the private sector. Then, more recently, we have the NGO sector that's grown up to deal with each one of these issues and advocate for solutions in each one of these issues. And many, many, many people now talk about the 3 legs of the stool that will be necessary to solve any of the issues we just spoke about. That we've gone way past the stage when hunger can be solved by government, or when the shift to deal with conservation can be dealt only with the creation of new technologies for different forms of energy. So if we're going to find solutions to the kinds of issues that you raised, it'll be because we figure out structures in which government, business, NGOs, and the fourth that I think has been left out of the equation by most people is literally us, ourselves. What is the way in which you come to the collective voice of citizens, the collective voice of the public, so that they actually are represented in a cross-sector solution to new economic development, to hunger, to whatever issue you want to bring up. The rest of my time with you is going to be sharing a bit of a journey around the development of methods and process to bring to the table in a meaningful way the collective citizen voice, which can be done at any level of system. It can be done locally, it can be done regionally, it can be done in a state, it can be done in a nation, and it can be done globally. We currently already have all of the technology necessary to do that. What we are missing is the will and the links that would allow us to do that in a timely way at the right moments. Okay. Hopefully there's still life here. I should say at the front end, when I created the model that you're about to see, I did it out of my own deep, deep concern about the health of democracy in my country. So when we do this work in the United States, the name that we're known by is America Speaks. And it literally is the intent, as I will show you in the next slide. The whole purpose of it is to re-engage citizens in the most important decisions that impact their lives. Someone already asked me yesterday, does that mean you want to move to direct democracy instead of representative democracy? No, not at all. But the problem is, and I'll speak just about my home country, although I know you can give examples from your own countries, the way the systems have grown over time, and particularly the politics and electoral system, citizens feel closed out. Citizens no longer feel like they are connected, even in a meaningful way, to their own representatives. The crisis we're in today in American democracy is very, very specific. There are, in the House of Representatives, 435 seats that are elected on a 2-year basis. There are in the Senate 100 seats that are elected on a 6-year basis. Because of the way electoral politics works, because of how money runs politics in the US these days, and because running a campaign is no longer a national dialogue, it is actually a corporate niche marketing campaign. That's a fact. It's an image that communicates quickly how things have changed. I'll give you one concrete example. We know from survey after survey that the vast majority of Americans are in favor of moderate, reasonable gun control. No Democrat in the United States of America can run on a platform of favoring gun control because the specific swing districts in the House of Representatives are areas in the country where the issue of the sense of can I own my own gun feels directly connected back to the revolution, and I don't want any laws about it. But it is not the majority of the American public. So let me just say again, the very specific crisis. This has happened before in American history, but again, we're living now. I loved what Fred said again this morning. The past is really important, but all we can really do anything about is where we are now. If you take the 535 seats that sit in our halls of representative democracy, and you look at the views, the ideology, and the values of that combination of 535 people, and then put it in how the system works, how much power special interests have to influence those individuals on specific votes. And it's important that I say this because I don't want to leave you with the impression this is only a matter of those individuals. This is a matter of the system they are sitting in and how it works. I've already told you, many of the people who want to run for office can't really tell the truth about what they believe about issues because if they did, they'd never get elected. Okay, so there's problem number one in a democracy. So we're ending up electing people both on the right, and in this moment in American history, it is the radical right that is the issue. They are collectively, they hold power in representative democracy that is way divergent from the collective voice of the American people. Are you with me? So we actually have a combination of people sitting in the 535 seats that are supposed to represent us that do not actually represent us on most of these important issues. That's a crisis in democracy. You with me? Okay. That's why I started America Speaks. And I spent 4 years as the chief of staff to the state of Ohio. Ohio is a big enough state, enough dollars in the state, that I understood how the special interest lobbying process works. I also understood extreme pain on the part of the elected officials who are holding those jobs because of a belief in the common good in both parties, and the extreme pain on the parts of individuals in the public who feel increasingly disconnected from the public sphere. So you take every level of analysis in the United States of America. What is the amount of space that citizens feel safe and secure to operate democratically about public policy issues. That space has been significantly reduced in my lifetime. Reduced to a level in the last 10 years that if you'd asked me 10 years ago, when I was already very concerned about this, could it be reduced as much more in 10 years as it has been reduced, I would have said no. But this is the reality that we are dealing with. Now, the game in the United States about citizens, and I'm sure you've seen this in your own countries, is while they mainly get related to is how they vote. Increasing numbers of Americans are not voting. So the elites who hold power in corporations, government, etc., begin the blame game. Citizens are apathetic. Citizens don't care. Citizens don't understand the initiative. So we built up an entire set of mythology, and it is literally myth, about what citizens are not capable or willing to do. Citizens don't participate in the current avenues for public expression because they don't trust them, they do not believe they're valuable, and they do not believe they'll make a difference. You take any human being, I do not care what their history of activism is. If you put me in enough circumstances where I can no longer see the connection between the effect of my behavior and the decision that was made, eventually I will stop taking action. I will withdraw from the public sphere. That's the real crisis in American democracy. Far too many individual people have withdrawn from the public sphere. But the question becomes, let's don't blame people from withdrawing from the public sphere. Let's do the analysis and the understanding about what does the public sphere look like? What are people invited into? How do they behave? Who treats what they did with credibility and real respect? So the fundamental goal of Doing America Speaks was, in fact, to experiment. And that literally was where we started, with recreating safe, democratic space in the country that people would feel a trust that if they participated, there would be, once again, a direct relationship between their behavior and an impact on what they care about. Now, I hope even while I've been talking, you have yourself been keeping it in your own context, in your own country. Obviously, Europe is in the middle of one of the largest experiments in creating a new governance structure that has ever been tried in human history. And obviously, the elites in Europe have clearly bought that structure at some pretty significant level of integration already. And obviously, if we just roll the cameras back to the French vote, the Dutch vote on accepting the new Constitution, there's a huge gap between the governance structure and the leaders who hold positions in that governance structure and where the public at large in Europe is about the value, the role, the extent to which they'll really give their allegiance and their identity to the European Union. At some point, I don't live here, I don't know it in detail, but at some point, that will be a crisis in European democracy because you have a governance structure which, in fact, people don't believe in. Now, I'm happy, let's see, how can I express this? I think it's fantastic that your governmental structures are way ahead of recognizing this. Margaret Wellstrom in the European Commission, literally today, has a budget of 150 million euros to spend over 2 years for experiments in how to connect the general European public to a deeper understanding of what the European Union is and how it works and what the role in their life is. 150 million euros. This country of Canada, on an annual basis, commits $1 billion a year to what they call public consultation. That's something I've been deeply involved in. Some of it's window dressing in certain bureaus and agencies, but a lot of it is deep conversations with the public about where the public believes the country should go on fundamental issues like health care. I'm ashamed and embarrassed to stand before you to say that the United States of America, the wealthiest country on the face of the earth, at least for a few more years, actually at a federal level spends almost no money on meaningful public consultation. In the US, where there's huge experimentation going on with the methods to create good public consultation, it's all a push from outside the government into the government. Where you are fortunate still enough to be sitting in a culture where I'd call it a pull. Literally, you're dedicating resources to pulling the public in. So, being given the gift of working in the Chief of Staff's office, someday I'll show the PowerPoint. What I also understood in the American culture was that to get out of the deep rut we're in about this, that you could no longer do this small scale and get anywhere fast enough. What had to happen was this work had to be done large enough scale with enough transparency and enough immediacy that in fact you could make a meaningful link between the collective public opinion and the decision makers as things were happening in the decision-making body. Scale also is totally significant in terms of getting the media to cover this. I'll just give you two comparing examples. Let's say we're going to take the issue of healthcare reform. Traditionally, public consultation has tended to be done in small, intense groups, 10 to 20, maybe 40 people. Well, you could get to 40,000 people doing it that way over a couple of years, but by then, the bills that are in the Senate and the House in the US would have come and gone. So the length of time it takes to replicate a small-scale style does not match the realities of how politics drives public policy, in addition to the substance of the issue driving public policy. Now, I want to make sure that in my saying this, nothing I've said leaves you feeling like I don't respect small-scale public deliberation. I absolutely do. And there are many, many cases in which small-scale public deliberation is exactly what should be done. And in our work at this stage, most of the projects we do involve both large-scale public deliberation and small-scale. But what I want to spend the rest of my time talking with you about is the how-to. One more method, as Fred said, to add to the toolkit of, in fact, enabling people to express collectively their will. That fundamentally is what a democracy is. That we believe that people actually could self-govern if they had enough information and if we had the process in place for the collective expression of what they wanted. I've said enough about that. Well, I want to say one more thing about this. The last bullet. I'm sure all of you in your work have already understood this. But in most divisive issues, as the issue becomes more and more embedded, what keeps us divided in large part is that socially and economically today, particularly in the North,
Can you talk?
socially and economically today, particularly in the North, we spend the majority of our time with people who are very much like us. Even the most diverse workplace is still all people who've bought the value of education and had the opportunities in their life to get there. We spend very little of our time actually interacting in any real way. This is another huge reduction in public space. You know, I have to not tell a lot of stories here, we'll get stuck. So here, credible opportunity. Most people, when given the chance, want fundamentally the same things for themselves, their children, and their grandchildren. So if you can create a public space which allows vast differences to share the discovery process of that common ground, this is frankly much easier than you think. I'm going to give you one example that I'll show some more slides about later. I live in Washington, D.C. It is my home, and I love the city. Washington, D.C. was created out of a swamp by George Washington in the early 1800s. And the only people who lived in Washington, D.C. in its early years were a few very, very wealthy landowners that George Washington was personally able to convince to buy a plantation in swampland, and the slaves who then worked that land. So right from its very, very roots, the city of Washington, D.C. had the have-not gap. Washington, D.C. is one of the few cities in the country that is an African-American majority city. About 62% of the population is African-American. Unlike other cities where that's true, today, because of the role of the federal government and financial institutions, Washington is one of the cities in the country that the most African Americans have been hugely successful. So there's a real bipolar distribution on the income level of African Americans, D.C. A lot of very wealthy African Americans and a lot of very poor African Americans. The mythology in Washington, D.C. about the city: most of the poor people live east of the Anacostia River. Most of the rich people, whether they're white or black, live in Northwest. And for decades, the belief in Washington is that the solutions for the city, what people in the city would want their mayor and their council to do, would be totally polarized based on your race, income, and where you live. Deeply held belief, reiterated by the media, reiterated by candidates when they run. The method that I'm going to show you, we began in 1999 to do in the city of Washington under the auspices of the mayor. So the mayor's authority was fully behind it. To do on a biannual basis citizen summits to set the priorities, to allocate the resources from people's taxes in how they wanted it spent. This is pretty radical. Most politicians are not willing to give up that much what feels like control. The new mayor understood the city terribly broken in education and police and healthcare. Weren't enough resources to solve any one of the problems, let alone all of them. So his logic was, why should I and a few council members and a bunch of special interest groups make the decision about the investment of taxes when in fact the entire city's future is at stake, and if we're going to do anything about this, it's going to take us a couple of decades, and we're going to have to do it collectively. So in the method you're going to see more graphically, we had 4,000 citizens in a room just multiplied just like this, 10 people at a table, literally demographically representative by race, by age, by gender, by income, and by geography. And when the people came in the room, they were divided up in tables, so a poor person from east of the Anacostia was sitting at, or 3 poor people were sitting at a table with 3 rich people and 3 middle-class people from different geographies. Lots of us knew this would happen based on other work, but it was an absolutely stunning to the people in the room. Stunning to the people in the room. When it came time for them at the end of 6 hours of discussion to actually vote on the budget priorities for the city, it was very, very shared, practically unanimous, and no differences across race, no differences across income, and no differences across geography. Everybody knew we had to do something about the poor quality of the schools. Everybody knew we had to do something about safety. The first year, those were the 2 highest priorities. After 6 months of work, this may be the most important compliment I think I've ever been paid for our work, because Washington was a deeply racially divided city. A group of African American leaders from across the river came to me after the end of the 6 months' work. And they were pretty, the woman who was their spokeswoman, again, there was still huge skepticism on her face, but she'd been in every step of this way, totally supported the budget, and stayed with the mayor to get it through the council. Literally what they said to me was, we've been part of this from the very beginning, and we don't exactly understood how you did this, but we've just had 6 months worth of discussion of the most important issues facing the city we love. And the word race never even came up. Now, I don't know if out of the context of US, if you can get the level of meaning of what that is. Because prior to that, for decades, all of the chatter all of the media coverage was that Washington could never be healed because the fundamental problem was a white-black problem. The fundamental problem was not a white-black problem. The fundamental problem was an inability to identify in a way that people believed in it, where should we invest our resources now to attempt to create the future of the city that we really want. Okay, quickly. Oops. You can tell I'm really technologically, why is it not fast forwarding? Yeah, that's what I did. So have I waited too long? We have to start again? I hope not. Okay. So this one? Okay. So 4 things I want to quickly just give you as the headlines about why this work turns out to be quite different than other approaches. First is the issue of transparently. Everything is visible in the public and is based on a link between citizens and decision makers. Much of what's done around the world as citizen engagement is done parallel to the decision process. If you take nothing else out of what I've said about this, we don't use this model unless the people who are in the governance structures, who are making the decisions, have agreed ahead of time to treat the data with integrity. Not to do everything that the public said, no one would do that, but to have it be visible about how they were influenced by the citizens' voices. The second critical thing, I've already said enough about it. Who participates has to be demographically representative. Who participates has to be informed. The utilization of information technology is how we take it to large scale, and then the principle of how big does this have to be in order for it to carry enough weight with the decision makers and with the media so that the media will cover it largely and play their rightful role of helping hold the public agencies accountable after the process is finished. Okay. I'm going to just very, very quickly, seems like it's taking a bit to load here. The context in which we've done I don't know what's happening. You'd never believe that we do this with thousands of people with no glitches, but I don't run the computer. Yeah, that's what I'm doing. Somehow it's not going from the... Okay. So these are the contexts that what we've currently done has been used in. Community, urban, regional planning. So big land use projects. But what we say when land use projects are being done, the social justice issues have to be brought in. We would not do just a land use project. The 2 largest scale processes we've done, you're going to see some pictures of one. Listening to the City was after the World Trade Center debacle in 2002, and we pulled together in one day, in an 8-hour discussion, 5,000 people, representative of the New York metropolitan area, overrepresented by people whose lives were the most impacted. This is an important principle I'll come back to. When you're doing public work, sometimes you have to overrepresent those people who've been most marginalized. It is not enough to just have their demographic numbers, particularly if they're from cultural or language groups that have not really been accepted in that community. They have to be in large enough numbers that they feel safe and connected to their group identity. Voices and Choices is a project we just finished in Northeast Ohio. It's 16 counties representing 4 million people, and the topic was revitalizing the economy. This is part of what you would know as the Rust Belt in the U.S. In the last 20 years, 1.2 million manufacturing jobs have been lost in these 16 counties, and in the last impact of our national policies on outsourcing, those jobs are never coming back. So the leadership was wise enough to know one of the major transformations is people who are in their 20s, in their 30s, in their 40s, in their 50s are going to have to totally retool themselves to do totally different jobs. So the issue of public support for the strategies was incredibly important. I just told you the neighborhood action story. We've done that in places besides Washington, D.C., but it's, I think at least 3 tables had the issue being the allocation of resources. It's clearly understood by everyone that there's a lot of distortion in the allocation of resources based on how much influence you have with the people who are making the decisions. So the role here is to level the playing field and have citizens themselves meaningfully back in the creation of budget priorities. Public policy formation. Your Health, Your Care, Your Say was a project in which we partnered with Patricia Hewitt, the Minister of Health in Great Britain, in which over a year's time regional summits were done around the country, and then in the end 1,000 British people randomly selected, because this was such high-level politics, they wanted there to be no question about whether or not the room was filled with virtually every kind of person in Britain. And that turned into a white paper that has now become the rules for how services that are outside the National Health Care Plan are delivered in Britain. Again, in the interest of time, because several of you work mainly in the corporate setting, we have over the years also used our method in very, very critical situations only for elites. Only where it's a group of leaders need to come up with a sense of their collective view of where they want to step. The Davos World Economic Forum that's held every year. In 2005, our method was used with 880 business, state, governmental, and NGO leaders. And the challenge that Klaus Schwab wanted to put on the table was, what did these leaders believe was where their dollars should be invested for actually changing the world we're living in? What were the 6 most important issues that should get investment from all sectors? So that people had time at the tables to talk, they'd had a lot of preparation beforehand, and then again through the method, they voted collectively. Much to everyone's surprise, the #1 issue that was selected in that context was poverty. Some of the journalists covering the issue, covering the meeting, immediately challenged that and said, this just shows that over the years Davos has slipped away from being a business forum to being now dominated by government and NGO. Because their belief structure, and this, I'm telling you this example because it is so critical in terms of how many places in the world were carrying a set of conventional wisdom. These are leading journalists from all over Europe and the United States and less from the southern continents, but they were there, who did not believe it was possible that the collective view, if it was dominated by business, would select poverty as the top issue for global investment. Because of the way the keypads work, they're cued to each person. So it took us about 3 minutes to do this. And we've never before done it in public because there are reasons why it could be divisive. But they were strongly challenging. So I, from the podium, just said, well, let's roll it back and let's separate. Let's see how business voted, let's see how government voted, and let's see how NGOs voted. And when we put it back up, I think I will remember it correctly, I believe the percentage that picked poverty at the highest level was 61 when it was done with all 880 people. What I do remember for sure is that when we looked only at the business votes, it was poverty selected by 2% higher. Okay? That made worldwide headlines. Every single journalist in that room wrote a story and interviewed the business leaders in the room about why did poverty come up to one of their top issues. Lots of you work with corporations, you would know why it was. It is the issue of emerging markets. It is the issue of the weight of the have-nots on the affluent world. It is in their own self-interest. But journalist frame was the only people who think poverty is the top issue are the bleeding hearts of the world, are those of us who've been out there trying to save poor people. So this is a process used with elites that can quickly make a discovery that the ordinary structures for dialogue in that organization or across organizations wouldn't have discovered. Okay. So, what does this look like? This actually is a picture of the Jacob Javits Center in New York City on July 21st, 2002. There are approximately 5,000 people in the room. In some ways, I'm sure that just looks like a blur to you, but it's just like this room. It's set up as 500 tables at which 10 to 12 people sit to talk through the significant issues about rebuilding in Lower Manhattan. Why was this extremely important to do? The history of New York City in terms of land use development is that it is made by a combination of alliances between two groups of people. Politicians, sometimes a single politician like the very famous Mayor Robert Moses, who was responsible for much of the physical development of the entire Manhattan Island. In the other case, it's the relationship between developers and politicians. Literally, the World Trade Center itself was enabled to be built when Nelson Rockefeller was the governor of New York and his brother David was working at the Chase Manhattan Bank. So after 9/11, there was a huge cry out from many, many people and organizations to say, this is 16 of the most valuable acres of land that exist anywhere in the world. And this is a horrible tragedy. But the truth of the matter is we're now looking at 16 acres totally open in the heart of Lower Manhattan. This should be developed in a way that expresses the hearts and minds and beliefs of the whole of the city. It should not be a decision made by developers and politicians alone. That's what created the possibility of doing this work. Table facilitation, and for those of you in the workshop, you're going to hear a little bit of repeat today, and I apologize. Every table, because remember, people are recruited so that the table has maximum diversity. Hundreds of stories out of New York City. A foundation head at the same table with a janitor who lived through the attack. The foundation head was learned by listening to that janitor something about the role of illegal immigrants in New York economy and something about the plight of the distance between work and home for people in low-income jobs in New York. That foundation president returned to his foundation and made some changes in the policy of how they were doing their economic development work and their poverty work in New York City. So extraordinary things happened for individuals at the table. This is 5 years later. There are still some of the table members that had a reunion this summer at that event in terms of how powerful and transforming that single day was in their lives. The Rockefeller Foundation, who partly paid for this, they had all of their NGOs that work with disadvantaged people in New York at this process, or had representatives of them. They have said that in terms of how they track individual behavior, that experience ended up having more continued empowerment for those low-income ethnic groups than any other single process they had ever seen. Now, this was unique because of where it resided in people, and I don't want to leave you with the impression that that total transformative experience is real for lots of people every time, but it does increase citizen activism on a sustained basis for something well over 50% of the people in the room. That is an extraordinary accomplishment. Okay, I've said enough about that. I probably haven't said enough about this. Daniel Yankelovich wrote a wonderful book called Coming to Public Judgment. And in that book, he talks about what does it take for a human being to come to an opinion on a public policy issue that will be sustained over time, that will not be impacted by the next television ad they see, that will not lose sight of because there's a negative TV campaign during an election. Two elements. Again, this is equally critical to change work in any context. One, for a person to understand their own deeply held perspectives on an issue, they have to articulate it themselves. So responding to a survey poll that puts in writing yes or no to this question, you do get an authentic answer from me about my yes or no to that question. But if in fact I dialogued about it, I might have discovered that it's a third place that I actually think about that issue. That's one of the reasons public opinion surveys go like that. Second element of what it takes for a person to come to a meaningful opinion on public policy. They need to be in dialogue with someone, or more than one someone, who thinks differently than they do. So I've said what I believe, but now I've also tested it. It's been tested by how you respond to me. It's been tested by your differences. And it is the exploration of the differences that eventually leads to a solidified view of what I believe about this. We use lots of graphics. We use lots of video. This is a little known, Washington, D.C., the nation's capital in the United States. 37% of the adult population in the city of Washington, D.C. are functionally illiterate. 37% of them would not be able to read and comprehend the document that you're looking at in front of there. So we've done two things about that. We put a lot into video, not people speaking, not people standing up in front of you and presenting the ideas. Literally engaging video with music, with art, with the 3 or 4 specific ideas that they must understand if they're going to make a choice about those budget priorities. When it's land use and regional planning, maps. Maps in New York City, literally the entire table was covered with a map blown up of the ground zero area, so that people could literally look at the existing transportation lines. People could literally look at the way in which the original World Trade Center had cut off Battery City Park from the rest of Lower Manhattan. That was one of the highest priorities for citizens. Rebuild the 16 areas in a way in which there's full east-west access in Lower Manhattan. If it had just been developers, do you think they would have recreated roads that had currently had office buildings on them? Not a chance. Okay. So the technology, how do we use the technology? Every single table has its own wireless laptop computer. When the table finishes its discussion, it sends the outcomes of its table discussion through the computer to a central computing area. And there a group of people, a group of people called the theme team. This is just like any research project you've ever done with a content analysis. They read real time. They're sitting in front of a computer screen. They're in pairs of people. So there's a balance and check system in each pair. They literally read what comes from the 100 tables, the 500 tables, whatever number it is, and they synthesize it and pull out 2 sources of data. The themes. What's coming from 400 of the 500 tables? And they also look for great ideas that come from just one table. One person at this table had this idea, and it's a wonderful idea. Other people might love it, but they didn't hear it. So because of the way we're working, you can quickly elevate an extremely creative solution and make it visible to 5,000 people, or 100 people, or 1,000 people, whatever the case may be. Once the theme team pulls out this information, it's put up on large screens, equally visible to everyone in the room. So transparency and immediacy. Decision makers love this. Journalists love this. This totally takes out the behind closed doors analysis of public input. It literally happens real time in the process. Now this slide, some of you up close may be able to see, this is one slide on the transportation options at Ground Zero. There, in fact, from the public, 11 themes came up. If we had just handed those 11 themes to the Port Authority and to the Lower Manhattan Development Corporation, it would have left a hole wide enough to drive a semi through. They still could have done whatever they wanted to do because there were going to be billions of dollars reinvested in transportation. So it's critical to go the next step. These are the 11 that reflect the 5,000 people, but of the 11, which do the collective gathered people think are most important? So you use the keypads, the individual keypads that most of you have probably used in some context today, to allow every single person, they've been through the discussion, they've seen what we collectively think, but now it's time for me to vote the way I think the priorities should be ranked. This allows for, you know, in our stream of work, there's the whole research about groupthink. When is there too many examples of I as an individual get tracked into a certain thought process because 9 of you felt differently than I did? Going back to an anonymous vote allows people, once again, an opportunity to express themselves under no circumstances of peer pressure. So very quickly you go from 11 to what's number 1, number 2, number 3, and I've done this now hundreds of times. Even though all 11 were very important to the collective gathering, it always falls out that somewhere between 3 and 5 are way, way higher in the percentages than the rest of the options, which means at that moment, and you literally can feel this in the room, at that moment there is public ownership of a set of recommendations about transportation investment. Why does this matter in terms of sustainability and what happens after the day people are together? It is because you are literally creating a public constituency for the outcomes that come that day. The mayor knew that he'd have several thousand people distributed across the city who would lobby for his budget priorities. In the case in New York, and this was headlines virtually every place in the world. We have a file in our office of 252 newspapers that have headlines that say something in the mode, public rejects the initial plans. And that was the #1 outcome of this process. The 6 plans that were taken to the public that day were totally rejected. And I can't take the time to tell this, all the detail to you, but if you looked at it, just common sense would have told you they would have been rejected. Because here's the big thing. Basically what the planners put out was build everything back that was on the site before, same square footage of commercial, same square footage of retail, and build a memorial. Now, anybody who'd ever been to the World Trade Center site would have known you couldn't respectfully build a memorial to what that meant to Americans and put 11,000 commercial square foot back, 11 million square foot of commercial space, et cetera, et cetera. So it was flawed in terms of a fundamental design criteria. Now that was the big no. This happened one Saturday. The next Friday, Governor Pataki stood up and held a press conference saying, we're throwing those plans out. We're starting over with a world-class competition. Many people came to us and said, well, then we should do another public forum once the design teams bring in their designs. I said it's not necessary, because if you could look at this, you can archive it at the Lower Manhattan Development Corporation. If you take the raw data that came off the computers, so that's not just the votes, that's virtually every idea that was entered into those computers that day, and you match that raw data up against the RFQ that went out to the world to, in fact, do the designs, there is a one-on-one relationship in all major areas except for 2 things. And think about, I mean, that is extraordinary. The fact that it's all but 2 is almost unbelievable. The 2 are the following. For 25 years, there had been in the books or on the shelf a plan for integrating the subway systems down into Lower Manhattan. Some of you I know have lived in New York, and you may know this history. Lower Manhattan was the first place to introduce subways, and it was done in the free market competition system. So they were intentionally not linked together. So you can only go north-south, 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 and then have to go someplace way up to Midtown to cross over to go back down. Okay, well, in our time frame, that's silly. But the infrastructure dollars it would take to do that were huge. There would never be another opportunity for that to happen. So that was put in as a given, not a choice. And it wasn't the highest priority on the public's part. The second piece, part of the mantra that got started in the United States after 9/11 happened was build them taller and higher, build them taller and higher. And if I may say it this way, I don't mean it disrespectfully of any specific male in the room, but it was the whole macho mentality. The only way to show we are as tough as we are is it should be 2 or 3 stories higher. Well, again, an undercurrent story around the world, but certainly in the U.S., there have been lobbying for years to change the laws about the height of skyscrapers because there's a lot of evidence, both issues around energy use, issues around air quality, and issues around safety for evacuation in any kind of emergency, not just a terrorist attack. The public, that was all presented to the public. And the public roundly said, do not build for occupation anything at the World Trade Center higher than, I'm not going to remember the number of the floor. The compromise, because a lot of special interest groups with a lot of power were pushing for the higher and taller. So those of you who've tracked this at all will know that what that evolved into was what's called the Freedom Tower. It is, in fact, a high commercial building that stops at a much lower floor than either of the previous World Trade Center towers, but then has a very inspiring architectural design for enough stories taller that in fact it is 111 instead of 110 or whatever it was. So with those 2 specific exceptions, the design request that went out matched the priorities from the public. Okay, one more slide and then I want to make a shift back to a way in which to try to link some of this work, give you a little bit of time for a couple of questions, but then shift back to transformation and give you a chance to work a little. Other critical element, visibility of the decision maker on the spot. So the public sees the connection that day. In the World Trade Center, it was the head of the Port Authority and the president of the Lower Manhattan Development Corporation. They are the people who closed the day. They stood on the stage and they said, this is how I've been impacted. Lou Thompson right away that day said, we clearly are going to have to go back to the drawing board. And Frank Reynolds, who was the chief engineer and the highest ranking official still alive from the Port Authority, because the Port Authority had their offices in the World Trade Center, the CEO, several board members, and several VPs died. Frank Reynolds literally cried. And this is a man, he's a civil engineer. Anyway, it was extremely moving to the public. There was not a single question in anyone's mind when they walked out of there. Nobody knew for sure how much difference it would make, but everybody knew it would make a difference. So in some way, the voice that is the governance structure really has to say how they have been impacted. The second piece, because we've got all the technology on site, we just bring a couple of industrial-sized copy machines to the place, and we actually print a document that gives the results of every single recommendation the public made that day, with the exception of maybe about the last 30 minutes, because you just can't have the turnaround time. It has given a literal new meeting to hot off the presses. And again, it's extremely empowering to citizens, because it means the decision maker, the media, and the people all walk out with the same information. Given the state of journalism in the world, and I'll speak only about our country, we have discovered that us doing this increases the quality of reporting rather substantially, because it means we've basically done their homework for them. Okay, I want to say quickly, and this presentation is up on TRIAS's website, so you can go up to it and download it. We track our work in terms of impact and outcome on 3 levels, each of which we believe is equally significant. Because if, in fact, transformation is going to happen on fundamental issues, it has to happen on all 3 of these levels. The first is what happens to the individuals. Do, over time, participation in these kinds of safe, democratic environments, do we end up with ordinary people who are taking more responsibility for the whole in their own community? The answer to that will be no surprise to any of you. Yes, in the immediate, it's very strong and very clear for more than 50% of the people who participate. if the sponsoring entity that held the process doesn't continue communication with them and doesn't show evidence of other environments in which they're bringing them in, then at the year stage, in the 2-year stage, it begins to tally off for some number of people, and yet it's only some percentage, we think it's about 28 or 29, that something has moved in them to say, this is who I am, this is how I want to operate, that are able to sustain it on their own. The second level, did the policy change? Now I can honestly tell you, when we're doing the strategy for this, there's really 3 big parts of the work. Phase 1 is all about strategy, credibility, positioning the work. In that stage, if we discover, and this is happening amongst politicians who see the power of this, they in fact already know what they want to do, and they want to get the 1,000 people there to endorse their direction that they already decided. If we discover that in the strategy phase, we don't do the project. Maybe sometime in the US, our political culture will have enough trust back in it that that kind of affirmation is also a valuable thing to do, but not now. And then the third is, what evidence is there of institutional and cultural change in terms of how people are involved? And since I've talked, I was going to give you a whole lot of examples about this, but since I've talked so much about the listening to the city, I'm just going to quickly give you one example that's been researched. A person said, I was a political conservative. I was amazed at what came out of my mouth. I said there should be low-income housing down there. And that captures the shift in mental mind or world view of an individual going through the process. At the policy change, I guess it's, I had a neighborhood action story there. The first year we did it, in 1999, almost $700 million of discretionary budget dollars ended up in a different program line than the mayor had originally proposed. And that held true over the 4 years. The first year where people wanted the money to go was education. Then a lot of skeptics said 2 years later, why are you going to do this again? DC's schools clearly aren't fixed. The public will just select education again. In that 2 years, DC had gone through a sea change in economic development, and the biggest issue on the public's mind was affordable housing. So they didn't do what people predicted they would do. And that enabled the mayor to create an affordable housing trust fund with enough political clout to keep it off budget. In listening to the city, I guess I already told you this. Governor Pataki, it's time to go back to the drawing boards. But the one I wanted to share with you in the institutional and cultural change, Paul Goldberger, who's probably one of the most renowned architecture, he's an architect and an architecture critic, literally has given tens of speeches currently saying this. I would be tempted to call listening to the city a turning point in the story, not only of the World Trade Center, but of American planning in general. Because what it did was blow up the conventional wisdom that ordinary people are not sophisticated enough to deal with the interrelationship between design, infrastructure investment, and the quality of life. And clearly it demonstrated writ large that it did. Columbia University, who Daniel Libeskind was the architect whose team won the competition, that basically the issue is that the public will now actually become part of the clientele in urban design. And those of you who've ever done this, you know architecture actually has wanted the public in it for many, many years. But they've been in a habit pattern of how they do it, which is charrettes. They bring the design to a public place, people go through it individually and comment on what they saw. So what many architects understood, what's the power of the public process, is to get the collective voice of the public, not just the aggregation of individual voices. And that's the issue of marrying excellent human dialogue supported by technology so that in a very short period of time you can come to understanding what's the collective will of this public gathering. Let me stop there. And I'm actually going to take time for maybe 3 questions if there's just a burning question in someone's mind, and then make a transition back to your tables for a closing. And you've been wonderfully patient with what I know is a tremendous amount of information and I hope valuable. Yes, please. Thank you, and I actually think in terms of the development of this work over time, her question was, how can you sustain this? And again, our belief is it needs to be sustained on the individual level, the policy level, and the cultural change level. Now I'll speak specifically in the US. What we've discovered, because governments aren't doing this on their own, because this is still, the press to do this mainly comes from outside, except occasionally where a mayor. So this mayor in Washington, D.C. has done this for the 8 years of his 2 terms. So the question is, will the new mayor, if you're talking about the institutional change, that would be the sustainability, will the new mayor do something that brings public voice into his budget process after he's elected? So a lot of citizens in Washington, our team, started working with, in fact, you'll love this story, I think. In the last citizen summit that we did for the current mayor, the old mayor thought this idea up himself. There were 5 candidates running for mayor. So we took the last 45 minutes of the 3,000-person meeting, and we let the 5 candidates all be on stage, and I essentially moderated a soft debate amongst the candidates, with the center of it being, what's your belief about how citizen invoices should impact public policy if you are elected as mayor? So that meant every one of those candidates publicly declared and were quoted in the Washington Post the next day as saying, if I'm elected mayor, citizen summits will continue, or or whatever they chose to say. Now, that was clever on our part, okay? No question about it. But the bottom line is, the sustainability will be the point at which when the bureaucracy in Washington, D.C., the budget officer who's not a political candidate, the agencies and how they show their program priorities in their computers transparent to the public, when that infrastructure continues on no matter who is the mayor, that would be institutionally sustained. Is that? Now, on the individual level, what we've discovered, and the big problem here is the digital divide. But because of all the tools on the internet for social networking, it's very easy today to keep individuals linked in small groups after they participate in something like this. The project we just did in Northeast Ohio, we've had 21,000 people in some version of deep dialogue about the economic future. And we've created on the website the capacity for as many of those people to stay together in small action groups as want to. The problem is the digital divide is real, and it's not just an income issue. There are lots of people, it's generational. There are lots of people who don't use the web yet enough in part of their personal lives that they think of that as the way to do it. So there's huge distances to go. But social networking, in which you allow the people to, our last summit there, at the end of the day it was a little chaotic, but we actually had people identify which action step do I want to be involved in. And then they self-organized into small groups before they left the room to continue working on it. So there's a couple examples. But it's huge territory. It's very little understood yet. Very little. Yes? Yes. Absorb it. Do you know, I didn't talk at all about outreach. She said, do we actually test the people in some way? The answer is no, we don't. We do a lot of small group work prior to the meeting in like groups where I would feel safe discussing this content. In Washington, for example, the first time we did this, we were very underrepresented by Hispanics. Part of the reason is in the U.S., Hispanics, almost low-income Hispanics who've immigrated in, live in multiple families in the same household, some of whom are legal and some of whom are illegal. Therefore, a barrier to their participation was even the legal people did not want to register because they did not want to be giving government their address. Once we understood the problem, we started working with the NGOs that work in that community. We went out to their communities. We took the materials to them. In the second summit, we were overrepresented. So you figure out the strategy for each group. Okay, I'm actually going to make the shift because I know that Gerhardt and their design committee had a real desire for you to end not focused on the particular large-scale method that I've been speaking to you about, but to fundamentally drop back inside again for a few moments. And let me just lay out a way to think about it. And then I'm going to ask you to take the last minutes we have here to discuss this at your table. Go back to the list of issues we had, and I don't know if you will remember them, but it was things like religious reconciliation. It was things like the environment and sustainable ecology. It was things like mindfulness and consciousness. It was the entire, or just go back to the ones you had at your own table is sufficient. I think it's safe for me to make the assertion here, standing in front of you, that if the human race is actually going to be capable of taking responsibility for reversing the trend that you described, that are what got us to where we are in that issue, it will require some transformation in governance structures. It will require the creation of new governance structures. What's a governance structure? It's who has the power to decide. If I just give the most obvious example at the global level, we have not a single global institution in the world today that is in any way selected by representation. Not one. If we take the UN, it's totally based on the balance of power between nations. If we take the governance structures that have been created in the last 15 years to deal with globalization of finance and the economy, they're all the trade organizations, WTO being the king of the pile. Well, WTO is hardly a representative organization. The significant bodies whose lives are most impacted by the decisions that agency makes have no line to get to that agency. So the premise is, one of our challenge is the creation or the modification, the transformation, whatever word you want to use. So 2 quick questions, one for you to think about yourself in the reality of your place in the world. Because the last impact I would want to have on anybody in this room is that you need to change what you're doing in order to take more responsibility for the whole. You may be exactly where you should be in your life, doing exactly what you're doing, but just adding the question of how can I take responsibility for the whole from the position I'm in. Just think a minute about that. Jot yourself a quick note. That's about you and your personal steps. And then we have time, I think, for maybe a 10-minute discussion at the table, just a brainstorming discussion. What do we think, what do I think is a step toward the creation of new governance? And it's in the theme of the conference. That's the structural transformation that the world is crying out for. How is power distributed? How are decisions made? That all sits in governance structures. So just a quick, I mean, again, this could be several weeks' work, but just a quick, put your best thinking out there about what might influence to create new governance structures. Enjoy.